I am not talking about macro evaluation of school systems or the broader educational system, but I am talking about teacher change, how we work with teachers in classrooms to help them understand their practice. And we're going to talk about two tools today. One of them is the use of observation protocols, and just a fancy name for things we look for when we go into classrooms and when teachers observe their practice. And a second broad category, more used by groups of evaluators, groups of teachers, and principals, and we'll call it classroom walks for today. But they actually go by lots of different names in the literature. And so because we know something about observation protocols, we decided to try and put something into practice to structure how we looked at each other's classrooms. So if you look in your handout, you have one example, the one that we created. And we were trying to figure out two things. What did the teacher do? And as a result, what did the student in the classroom do? Could we identify particular strategies or methods or questions that were pushing the students in our class that really began to engage them? And we tried to figure out what to look for. Did it matter how the furniture was set up or how we got started? And we created this protocol. What's the teacher doing and what's the student doing? So if you take a second to look through it, you'll see nothing very fancy. Simple questions. My favorite is the last on the left-hand side. I think it's on the back of the page. And it was quite interesting when someone watches your teaching. They see things that you don't see. So we worked with each other to identify what we called moments. The moment in a class when something really important happened. So the peer observer, the other person, Grzegorz in my case, would take some notes as he was watching what was happening. But the most important use of the tool was afterwards in the bar, where we would talk about what the person saw, raise questions, and argue about its interpretation. And we would often have very different interpretations of what actually happened in that classroom. The second protocol you have is for a different purpose. This is a second project I worked on with a colleague back home in Ohio. Sevilla Bannister is a faculty member interested in technology and in social justice. And especially she looks at how technology is used by teachers to help bring students up. So working with her, we created this observation protocol that looked at a couple of things. How is the teacher talking to students? How is technology being used in the classroom? What kind of work is the teacher asking the student to do? And she had two different versions of the protocol. One she calls a quick stop, and with that, she or I would go in the classroom, no more than 5 minutes, what is happening, very quickly making notes. And in the second version, stay in the classroom for about 1 hour, watching an entire lesson. All right. Before we go visit two classrooms, I want to take a second to look a little bit at some of the things coming out of the research that's happening in different parts of the world. And while I really believe that lots of things happen in classrooms that are unique to the context, when you start looking at the research across different parts of the world, you see common elements being discussed. So Marzano, Burns, Schmoker, William, Popham, some examples of the things they mentioned. And in the United States, Boykin and Noguera, also some things where you look for student engagement. This concept of on-task behavior, that the student is engaged in what's happening in the classroom. And a second concept that we would call deep involvement, that the student has to really struggle with some concepts. And over time, what kind of attitude do the students display, what kind of curiosity, what kind of involvement. But again, I have to give you a big caution. Teachers have unique teaching strategies that work for them based on their personality. And when we're observing teachers, I believe we have to respect their individuality, but also push them on what they're doing. And when we look at evaluating what they're doing in the classroom, we have to be careful not to rely just on the test scores that result from their teaching practice. So when we're thinking about evaluating teachers and observing practice, we have to be careful to think about how we're going to have teachers work with each other and work with us to raise up their practice. So I'm not a fan of teacher observation between peers or between others that's designed to punish. And I will tell you of one more bad example. In many school districts in Ohio right now, the principal has an iPad, a tablet, and on the tablet are things to look for, and the principal shows up in the classroom, looks very quickly, leaves the classroom, hits report on the tablet, and the teacher receives an email into their email system saying, today, not a very good lesson. And the teachers call this being iPadded, which I don't know how you'll even translate. No feedback, no discussion, no working together. And if we're going to raise practice, the discussion, feedback, and reflection are the most important part. I sense right away that it's a science class. For my signals, the stools and the kind of tables tell me, science. The teacher says, okay, we're going to get started. And he says, to start, we're going to huddle, come together. The students move. My favorite symbol of the context of this particular classroom, they feel comfortable sitting on the tables, but they look like they've done this before. And when I walk in a classroom, I pick a couple students to watch. And while I try and watch everything going on, I keep going back to that 1, 2, or 3 students and see what their level of engagement is. I have 2 questions for you. And you don't have to answer them out loud. Have to answer them out loud. Just think about your answers. Did your criteria or what you were looking for help you figure out what was going on in this classroom? And what were you worried about with your criteria? The content, the feel of the classroom, the relationship between the teacher and students. And I know that the teacher's very aware that the video camera is following him around. But if you had come in this classroom for 5 minutes, what would you want to talk about with this teacher? Does it matter that 50 minutes into the lesson, students are working on experiments, gathering data, and still working and working and working? Does it matter that they sat on the tables? Does it matter that the teacher did not want to talk about the personal question from the student and what really matters to you? So Grzegorz and I, in our observation protocol, had particular things that we were looking for. Sevilla and I had other things that we were looking for a different purpose. So observation protocols can change based on the purpose and what it is I'm actually working on right now with this group of teachers. So if we want to look at an entire school as a principal or a headmaster, to step outside just working with one teacher or having teachers working with each other. In our last few minutes, I want to show you these 2 methods, learning walks and classroom walkthroughs.